This lecture is on Chapter 18, the blood. Let's look at the characteristics of blood. There's around 1.2 to 1.5 gallons of blood, which equals about 10 units, that exists within the blood vessels. Blood is scarlet colored when oxygen rich and dark red colored when oxygen poor. Blood is slightly alkaline in its pH, around that 7.35 to 7.45. Remember from the homeostasis lecture. And then the temperature of the blood is 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Blood has several vital functions. First off, it transports oxygen to tissues and carbon dioxide and other wastes away from tissues. Blood also transports hormones and other chemicals. Blood functions in defense against pathogens, which are disease-causing agents. Blood removes cancerous cells, along with dead and dying cells. And blood also prevents blood loss through clotting. Blood maintains homeostasis in that it maintains body temperature, water-salt balance, and body pH. For the body temperature, blood picks up heat in the active tissues and distributes it throughout the body. For water-salt balance, the osmotic pressure of blood maintains fluid balance within the body tissues. And blood contains buffers that help maintain that pH from 7.35 to 7.45. The composition of blood consists of layers after it's been put through a centrifuge. The top layer is going to be made of plasma, which has water and dissolved substances. It's the lightest layer, which is why it's on top. And it makes up 55% of the whole blood by the volume. The bottom layer is formed elements, such as the white blood cells, which make the upper buffy coat, and the red blood cells, which make the lower hematocrit. The formed elements are going to be heavier than the plasma, which is why they sink to the bottom, and the red blood cells are the heaviest of all. Hematocrit is the percent of blood volume that consists of red blood cells and normally makes up 45% of the composition of blood. Males usually have a higher hematocrit level than females. Here's how to take a blood sample and separate it through a centrifuge. In step 1, withdraw the blood and place it in a tube. Step 2, load into the centrifuge and turn it on, and then it will spin around. And what you see here is the contents of the blood separated. The lighter contents are on the top and the heavier contents are on the bottom. The plasma, which is the lightest or less dense of the contents, is going to be made up primarily of water, and as you can see, it takes up about 55% of the entire blood. The buffy coat's in the middle, and that's your leukocytes and platelets. It's less than 1% of the blood. And erythrocytes are going to be the most dense or heaviest components and makes up 45% of the blood. This is a slide of blood. The empty space you see around the cells would be the plasma, and the red blood cells are the most numerous elements. The white blood cells are going to be various in their structure and function, and then the platelets are the small purple stained objects. Plasma is over 90% water. It contains the proteins albumin and fibrinogen. It also contains nutrients, electrolytes, gases, and hormones. This table describes the contents of plasma. Water, 90 to 92% of the plasma. Proteins are 7 to 8% of the plasma. Inorganic ions like salts are less than 1% of the plasma, and then gases. So for water, it maintains the blood volume and transports molecules. Plasma proteins are going to maintain blood osmotic pressure and pH. Salts will also maintain blood osmotic pressure and pH. Salts also aid in metabolism. For the gases, the oxygen will assist in cellular respiration, and the carbon dioxide is the end product of metabolism and is a waste product that must be breathed out. The nutrients that flow through plasma include lipids, glucose, amino acids, phospholipids, and vitamins. These are food for the cells. Nitrogenous waste, such as urea, uric acid, and ammonia, are excreted by the kidneys and will leave the body. And then regulatory substances such as enzymes, hormones, and other chemical signals will help to aid in metabolism. Hemopoiesis is the formation of formed elements. The formed elements are produced continuously in the red bone marrow of the skull, ribs, vertebrae, iliac crest of the hips, and the ends of the long bones. Multipotent stem cells, such as red bone marrow cells that become other blood cells. They replicate by mitosis. Each daughter cell then differentiates into myeloid stem cells or lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells further differentiate into red blood cells, granular leukocytes, monocytes, megakaryocytes, and lymphatic stem cells will differentiate into lymphocytes and natural killer cells. This illustration shows hemopoiesis, and it begins with the multipotent stem cells in red bone marrow. These are stem cells that can divide into many different types of cells. First, they will divide into either myeloid stem cells or lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells will then form erythroblasts or megakaryocytes or myeloblasts or monoblasts. The erythroblasts will then differentiate and mature into erythrocytes. Megakaryocytes will actually break apart into platelets. Myeloblasts will differentiate into the granular leukocytes known as basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils, and monoblasts will differentiate into monocytes. Then the lymphoid stem cells will produce the white blood cells known as B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and the natural killer cells. Note that myeloblasts, monoblasts, and lymphoblasts all produce the white blood cells. So each of these white blood cells has varied stem cell lines that they come from, all originating from the original multipotent stem cells in the red bone marrow. Let's look at the characteristics of erythrocytes. Erythrocytes have no nucleus or organelles. Instead, they contain hemoglobin to transport oxygen. Erythrocytes have a biconcave disc formation which allows flexibility for movement through capillaries. Erythrocytes contain the protein called spectrin, which maintains the red blood cell shape. The lifespan of a red blood cell or erythrocyte is 100 to 120 days. About 2 million red blood cells are produced per second to keep the red blood cell count in balance since they have such a short lifespan. The reason they have a short lifespan is because they have no nucleus, and so they can't replenish their spectrin, which is what helps to maintain their shape, and so ultimately they degrade. This is a view of the biconcave disc. You can see that the pressed insides show where the nucleus once was. This allows for that flexibility as the red blood cells move through capillaries. They can bend and flex. They don't get jammed up. Erythrocytes contain proteins called hemoglobin. There's about 200 million hemoglobin proteins per erythrocyte. They are the respiratory pigments. Oxyhemoglobin is formed when oxygen binds with hemoglobin. That's what gives you the bright scarlet red. Hemoglobin that is not combined with oxygen is called deoxyhemoglobin, which is dark maroon in color. Anytime you see DE in front of a prefix, that means without it. This illustration shows hemoglobin, and it consists of globin, which is 2 alpha and 2 beta polypeptide chains, as well as 4 heme groups, which will bind to iron. And this is what will help to carry the oxygen. Let's look at the production of red blood cells. Myeloid stem cells give rise to erythroblasts, which divide many times. As they mature, erythroblasts gain many molecules of hemoglobin and lose their nucleus and most of their organelles. Erythropoietin stimulates the production and maturation of erythrocytes. In the illustration, we see that when there's low blood oxygen content, that is the stimulus for the kidneys to increase the production of erythropoietin. Then the red bone marrow stem cells will increase red blood cell production. Blood oxygen contents will return to normal, and the normal blood oxygen content is the resolution of the stimulus. This is a homeostatic feedback loop. This would be negative feedback because we're going to reverse the effects of the stimulus. The low blood oxygen content is the stimulus and it's not sustainable, and so we need to raise the blood oxygen content back to normal levels. So this is the familial tree of the erythrocyte. It starts with a hemocytoblast, and then once it becomes a committed cell, it is then the proerythroblast, so the pre-erythroblast. Anytime you see blast, that's some type of developing cell. And so in the phase 1 is ribosome synthesis of the early erythroblast, and then in phase 2, hemoglobin accumulation occurs in the late erythroblast and normoblast. In phase 3, the ejection of the nucleus occurs in the normoblast, and a reticulocyte is formed. Finally, the erythrocyte is matured and can start its function. Since the erythrocytes only live 100 to 120 days, they must be degraded. So the destruction of the red blood cells occurs as they are destroyed in the liver and the spleen by macrophages. Hemoglobin is separated into its components. The globin portion is broken down into amino acids that are recycled by the body. Iron is recovered and returned to the bone marrow for reuse. The heme portion is degraded into bile pigments, the yellow pigment bilirubin and the green pigment biliverdin. That should say green. And rubin is yellow and verdin is green. And these are both excreted by the liver. Sometimes there are abnormal red blood cell counts, and this is known as anemia. In anemia, blood has reduced oxygen carrying capacity due to decreased hemoglobin or decreased number of red blood cells. The types of anemia can include hemolytic, which is the increased rate of red blood cell destruction, or sickle cell, which is genetic and abnormal hemoglobin proteins change the shape of the red blood cell. They can no longer then travel through the capillaries and they get backed up and can take away blood flow to tissues. Other types of anemia include iron deficiency, which comes from low iron intake, or pernicious, which is a lack of vitamin B12, which is an important vitamin in blood cell formation. Aplastic is bone marrow damage, and then hemorrhagic comes from blood loss. Now let's take a look at leukocytes. Leukocytes are a complete cell and they are crucial to immune defense. They are not confined to the bloodstream. They can do diapedesis, which is where they go through the margins of the blood capillaries. They have positive chemotaxis, meaning they are attracted to chemicals. And leukocytosis, when they are accumulating in a wound. In order of most abundant to least abundant, the leukocytes are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. The mnemonic "never let monkeys eat bananas" will help you to remember this. Here's a picture illustrating diapedesis, or the moving through the margins of the capillaries by the white blood cells. And the reason they do this is to get into the interstitial or tissue fluid so that they can clean up debris and pathogens that might be in the area as a result of a wound. There are two main types or groups of leukocytes. There's granulocytes and agranulocytes. For the granulocytes, these include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. They have cytoplasmic granules that stain specifically with Wright's stain. They are larger and shorter lived than red blood cells. They have lobed nuclei, and they're phagocytic, meaning that they will go and eat bacteria and debris. Phago means to eat. So here we see the neutrophil. It's a multi-lobed nucleus, and I always remember them as bacteria slayers. They are really good at eating bacteria. Eosinophil has a bilobed nucleus and red cytoplasmic granules, and these are worm killers. They go in and oxidize worms and get them out of your body. And then basophils are bilobed nucleus, purplish black cytoplasmic granules. And I remember basophils as like releasing histamines. And so neutrophils are neutrally stained, eosinophils are acidic stained, and then basophils are alkaline stained or basic. Agranulocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes, and they lack granules, and they have spherical or kidney-shaped nuclei. So here we see a small lymphocyte, and you can't really differentiate a T lymphocyte from a B lymphocyte just by looking at them. It's what they do that makes them different. And then a monocyte is a kidney-shaped nucleus and is the largest of the leukocytes. So here's the familial lines of the leukocytes. It starts with the hemocytoblast, and this divides either into a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. Myelo means the bone marrow, so these go into continue to mature in the bone marrow, and they become myeloblasts or monoblasts. The myeloblasts will then develop into eosinophils, basophils, or neutrophils, which are the granular leukocytes. The monoblasts will develop into the agranular leukocyte known as the monocyte. And then the lymphoid stem cells will differentiate into the T lymphocytes and the B lymphocytes. Sometimes there are abnormal white blood cell counts. Leukopenia is a low white blood cell count. Leukocytosis is a high white blood cell count. Differential white blood cell count is a count of the individual types of white blood cells. Mononucleosis is a viral infection, and it has a large number of abnormal lymphocytes. Leukemia is a cancer, which is an uncontrolled production of white blood cells. Now let's take a look at platelets. Platelets are cytoplasmic fragments that are important in blood clotting. In this illustration, I just wanted to remind you of the platelets, which are the degraded elements on the left side. And you can see neutrophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes as the white blood cells, and then all the erythrocytes scattered throughout the plasma. Okay, this table will summarize the functions of the erythrocytes and the leukocytes. So remember, the erythrocytes are red blood cells, or RBCs. They're biconcave, anucleate disc, and they are going to live about 100 to 120 days, and they will transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. The leukocytes have granulocytes and agranulocytes. The granulocytes are neutrophils, which are multi-lobed, and they phagocytize bacteria. Remember, they're bacteria slayers. Eosinophils are going to have a bilobe nucleus, and they'll stain red because they're acidic, and they will kill parasitic worms. Basophils will have a bilobe nucleus, and they will stain purplish and black in a basic dye, and they will release histamine. Agranulocytes include the lymphocytes, which have a spherical or indented nucleus, and they mount the immune response by direct cell attack or via antibodies, and they'll be T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. And then monocytes will have a nucleus that is U or kidney shaped, and they will do phagocytosis and will develop into macrophages in the tissues. And so these are the largest of the leukocytes, which makes sense because macro means large and phage means to eat. So they are large cells that will eat debris and bacteria. Then we have the platelets, which are going to be fragments that will seal the small tears in the blood vessels, and they are instrumental in blood clotting. Hemostasis is the stoppage of bleeding. Hemostasis has 3 overlapping phases. Step 1 is the vascular spasm, where the blood vessel constricts to limit blood loss. Step 2 is platelet plug formation. The platelets arrive at the site of injury and adhere to exposed collagen fibers. And step 3 is the coagulation phase. Coagulation cascade converts inactive proteins to the active forms, which ultimately form fibrin strands of a blood clot. In the first stage of blood clotting, the vascular spasm causes blood vessel constriction. This is the first phase in response to blood vessel injury. Vascular spasm limits blood leakage, and it lasts from few to many minutes. During this time, platelets and endothelial cells release chemicals that stimulate further constriction. Greater vasoconstriction with greater vessel damage. Next, platelet plug formation occurs. When the blood vessel is damaged, a platelet plug is formed. Collagen fibers in the vessel wall are exposed, and the platelets will stick to collagen with the help of von Willebrand factor. Platelets develop long processes allowing for better adhesion, and many platelets will aggregate together and close off the injury. To activate the platelets, platelets release chemicals such as serotonin and thromboxane A2, which cause prolonged vascular spasms. Adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and thromboxane A2 attract other platelets and facilitate their degranulation, which is a positive feedback mechanism. Procoagulants will then stimulate coagulation. Mitosis stimulating substances will trigger the repair of the blood vessel. The platelet plug forms quickly in about 1 minute, but is prevented from getting too large by prostacyclin secretion by nearby healthy cells. Prostacyclin inhibits the sticking of platelets to the vessel wall. During the coagulation phase, the network of fibrin, which is an insoluble protein, will form a mesh. Fibrin comes from the soluble precursor known as fibrinogen. The fibrin mesh traps erythrocytes, leukocytes, platelets, and plasma proteins to form the clot. This illustration shows the fibrin strands trapping platelets and erythrocytes. Substances involved in coagulation includes calcium, clotting factors, platelets, and vitamin K. Clotting factors are mostly inactive enzymes, and they are named simply in order of their discovery, not in which comes first in the clotting process. So factor 1 would be fibrinogen, factor 2 prothrombin, etc. Most clotting factors are produced in the liver. Vitamin K is a fat-soluble coenzyme required for the synthesis of clotting factors 2, 7, 9, and 10. Some factors, for example factor 7, are proteases that cleave other factors from inactive to active forms. Rat poison is a poison that prevents vitamin K from synthesizing clotting factors. In the initiation of the coagulation cascade, the clotting will start with the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways. The paths converge into one common pathway. The intrinsic pathway is initiated by platelets upon damage to the inside of the vessel wall, and it has 5 steps that are completed in 3 to 6 minutes. And as you can see, the factors are going to cascade and convert each other from the inactive factors to the active factors. Also note that calcium is involved. The extrinsic pathway is initiated by damage outside of the vessel, and it has 2 steps that only take about 15 seconds. And again, an inactive factor will be converted to an active factor, and calcium will be involved. The common pathway is going to be activated by the extrinsic or intrinsic pathway, and as the others are going to include taking inactive factors and turning them into active factors. Ultimately, the positive feedback will lead to clot formation, and the clot will stop once fibrin fills the mesh. Extra fibrin is destroyed by enzymes in the blood. This illustration shows the intrinsic pathway and the extrinsic pathway and how they combine to form the common pathway. The extrinsic pathway is much quicker than the intrinsic pathway, and all of these pathways are going to involve turning inactive factors into active factors. Calcium will be involved in these processes. The clot must eventually be eliminated, and clot elimination includes clot retraction and fibrinolysis. During clot retraction, actinomyosin, which is a protein within the platelets, contracts and squeezes serum out of the developing clot, which makes it smaller. During fibrinolysis, the degradation of fibrin strands occur by plasmin. It begins within 2 days after clot formation and occurs slowly over a number of days. Bleeding disorders can occur, such as hemophilia. Hemophilia A and hemophilia B are the most common, and they occur in an X-linked recessive pattern. Males exhibit the full-blown disease, and females are typically carriers because of this X-linked trait. And it can result from deficiencies in factor 8, 9, or 11. Thrombocytopenia is a platelet deficiency. It is going to occur when bone marrow infections or cancer occur, and the platelets can have an increased breakdown or decreased production. Certain drugs can interfere with clotting and cause bleeding. For example, aspirin, ibuprofen, warfarin, and even ginkgo. Hypercoagulation is the increased tendency to clot the blood. It can lead to a thrombus, which is a blood vessel clot. When dislodged within the blood, an embolus can occur. If the embolus lodges in the lungs, this is called a pulmonary embolism. This can cause breathing problems and death. Heparin is a blood thinner, and anticoagulants are administered during surgery to prevent deep vein thrombosis. Now let's take a look at the ABO blood groups. Blood types are going to depend on surface antigens projecting from the erythrocyte membrane, and these blood types can be grouped into the ABO blood groups. They are determined by the presence or absence of A antigens and B antigens. A and B antigens are membrane glycoproteins. In type A blood, erythrocytes have surface antigen A only. In type B blood, erythrocytes have surface antigen B only. In type AB blood, erythrocytes have both antigens, and in type O, erythrocytes have neither antigen. A person's antigen status determines their antibody status. Anti-A antibodies react with surface antigen A. Anti-B antibodies react with surface antigen B. A person doesn't have antibodies for their own surface proteins. A person does have antibodies to antigens that are foreign to them. Type A blood has anti-B antibodies in its plasma. Type B blood has anti-A antibodies in its plasma. Type AB blood has neither anti-A nor anti-B antibodies in its plasma. And type O blood has both anti-A and anti-B antibodies in its plasma. This table illustrates the ABO blood types. For blood type A, the surface antigen is A, and it has anti-B antibodies in the plasma. For type B blood, the surface antigen is B, and it has anti-A antibodies in the blood plasma. In type AB blood, the surface antigens are A and B, and the plasma has neither anti-A nor anti-B antibodies. And then in type O, neither surface antigen A nor B, and both anti-A and anti-B antibodies are in the plasma. This table summarizes the ABO blood types. In AB, the agglutinogens are A and B, and the serum reaction will show if anti-A and anti-B. In B, the blood agglutinogens are B, and the serum reaction will be anti-A and negative and anti-B positive. In blood type A, the agglutinogens will be A, and the serum reaction will be positive for anti-A and negative for anti-B. And then in blood type O, there are no agglutinogens, and so there will be no serum reaction. And this is why O is the universal donor. Rh blood types are going to depend on the presence or absence of Rh factor, which is surface antigen D, which exists on erythrocytes, and it determines if the blood type is positive or negative. Antibodies to Rh factor are not usually there. They only appear after Rh negative person is exposed to Rh positive blood. ABO group and Rh type are reported together. For example, if all three antigens are present, blood type is described as AB positive. Clinical considerations about the blood type. If someone receives an incompatible transfusion, agglutination occurs. What happens in agglutination is that the recipient's antibodies bind to transfused erythrocytes and clump them together. This can block blood vessels and prevent normal circulation. It can cause hemolysis or the rupture of erythrocytes and can lead to organ damage. Here's a really good table that summarizes what the blood types can donate to and receive blood from. So with A positive, they can donate to A positive and AB positive, and they can receive from A positive and A negative. They can also receive from O positive and O negative. If they're an A negative blood type, they can donate blood to A positive and A negative, or AB positive and AB negative. And they can receive blood from A negative and O negative, and so forth and so on. This can be a life-saving knowledge, and your blood will be typed before blood transfusions are given. This is what happens if an improper blood transfusion is given to a patient. The blood agglutination of the erythrocytes will start to block the small blood vessels. Here is an agglutination test, like the chart that I showed previously. And if there is clumping, then that is not a match. Whole blood transfusions are used when blood loss is substantial. Packed red cells, where the plasma is removed, are used to restore oxygen carrying capacity, and transfusion of incompatible blood can be fatal. Rh incompatibility and pregnancy is something to take seriously. In an Rh negative mom, she may be exposed to the Rh positive blood during childbirth of an Rh positive baby. She now has the anti-D antibodies, and in future pregnancy, they may cross the placenta and destroy fetal red blood cells. This can result in the hemolytic disease of the newborn. The infant has anemia, hyperbilirubinemia, heart failure, and the prevention of this is to give the pregnant Rh negative woman a special immunoglobulins. And this illustration shows the hemolytic disease of the newborn. You can see the child is Rh positive and the mother is Rh negative. And when red blood cells leak across the placenta, the mother will make anti-Rh antibodies. Antibodies will then attack an Rh positive red blood cells in the second child. So the first child usually isn't affected. It's the second child that will be. And that's the end. Thank you for listening.